While examining a 91-year-old woman, the doctor discovered that she had been pregnant for 60 years. Hello, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment on what you think will happen, and let's see if you can guess correctly. Write your prediction below, and at the end, I'll give you the answer. Dr. Michael Thompson had been practicing medicine for over 30 years, but nothing had prepared him for what he was about to uncover. It was a quiet afternoon at the clinic when Mrs. Evelyn Carter, a 91-year-old woman, entered for her routine checkup. Evelyn had been a regular patient for years, always full of stories about her youth and the world she had seen change over the decades. Despite her age, she had always been relatively healthy, save for the occasional aches and pains typical for someone her age. However, during this visit, something seemed different. Dr. Thompson noticed a subtle change in her demeanor. She appeared more fatigued, her skin a little paler than usual, and there was a strange distension in her abdomen. He decided to run a few extra tests, just to be sure. As Dr. Thompson examined the ultrasound, his brow furrowed. What he saw on the screen didn't make sense. There, nestled within her abdomen, was a large mass. At first, he feared it might be a tumor, but the shape was oddly familiar. His heart raced as he studied the image more closely. It couldn't be. The realization hit him like a freight train. Mrs. Carter had been carrying a fetus for an inconceivable length of time. The fetus, calcified and mummified over decades, appeared as though it had been there for years, perhaps even decades. Dr. Thompson could hardly believe his eyes. How could something like this go unnoticed for so long? And more importantly, how could Mrs. Carter not have known? Evelyn sat quietly as Dr. Thompson composed himself. She noticed his growing concern but remained calm, her expression a mixture of curiosity and resignation. After all, at her age, she had learned not to be easily shaken by the unexpected. "Doctor, you look like you've seen a ghost. Is everything all right?" Her voice was steady, though her eyes searched his face for answers. Dr. Thompson hesitated for a moment before responding. "Mrs. Carter, I need to ask you a few personal questions. Have you ever been pregnant before?" Evelyn's eyes clouded with memory, and after a long pause, she replied softly, "Yes, but it was a long time ago, nearly 60 years, in fact." The room fell silent. Dr. Thompson's mind raced with possibilities. Could this be related to her pregnancy all those years ago? He asked her to recount the story. Evelyn's voice, though frail, carried the weight of decades of heartache as she described her lost pregnancy, a tragic event that had occurred when she was in her early 30s. The child had never been born, and the doctors had assured her that her body had naturally absorbed the fetus. She had grieved and moved on, or so she thought. Now, sitting in front of Dr. Thompson, she began to realize that perhaps the past had never truly left her. As the weight of the discovery settled in, both the doctor and his patient knew this was only the beginning of a much larger mystery. Evelyn Carter left the clinic that day with more questions than answers. The thought of carrying a child for 60 years without knowing weighed heavily on her mind. It was an unsettling revelation, one that gnawed at the edges of her consciousness. Her once sharp memories of her pregnancy, the heartbreak of losing her baby, and the assurances from her doctors all came rushing back. Could they have been wrong? How could something as significant as this have been overlooked? As she sat in her quiet, dimly lit living room later that evening, Evelyn stared at the family photos that lined her shelves. Her late husband, John, had passed decades ago, never knowing the child that was lost to them. What would he have thought if he knew that their child had never truly left her? Dr. Thompson, on the other hand, found himself drowning in medical literature and case studies. The condition, known as lithopedion or stone baby, was incredibly rare, with only a handful of cases ever recorded. The fetus, unable to be absorbed by the body, had calcified over time to protect the mother from infection. In most cases, women who developed lithopedion had no idea it had happened, and the condition remained asymptomatic for years, even decades. But 60 years? That was nearly unheard of. Dr. Thompson was determined to understand how this had happened to Evelyn and what, if anything, needed to be done now. The fetus, though inert, could still pose a risk, especially given Evelyn's advanced age. Back at the clinic, the medical staff buzzed with whispers about the discovery. It wasn't every day that such a case came through their doors. While Dr. Thompson tried to maintain professionalism, he knew word was bound to spread. He met with a few colleagues to discuss the situation, seeking their advice on how best to proceed. Most agreed that the fetus should be left alone unless it started causing Evelyn physical distress. Any attempt to remove it could be too dangerous, given her age and frailty. But there was one young doctor, Dr. Sarah Patel, who couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something. "What if there's more to this? Shouldn't we investigate further?" she asked during a meeting. Dr. Thompson respected her curiosity, but his priority was Evelyn's safety. Still, the seeds of doubt were planted. Evelyn, despite her outward calm, began to feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She had always prided herself on being strong, resilient through life's many trials. But this discovery, this stone baby, was something different. It was as if the ghost of her past had returned to haunt her, a physical manifestation of the grief she thought she had buried long ago. As the days passed, she found herself growing more introspective. She wondered what life would have been like if the child had been born. Would it have changed her marriage? Her relationship with the rest of her family? The thought of telling her children, now grown with families of their own, weighed heavily on her. Would they even believe her? And what would they think of the mother who had unknowingly carried this secret for so long? Evelyn could no longer ignore the growing sense of unease. Though she remained composed on the surface, her mind was racing with the implications of Dr. Thompson's discovery. The idea that she had unknowingly carried the remnants of her lost pregnancy for so many years filled her with a strange mixture of sorrow and disbelief. She had always been a strong woman, a survivor, but this revelation stirred something deep within her. It wasn't just the shock of the medical anomaly, it was the emotional weight of it. She had never fully come to terms with losing the child, and now it felt as though the past was reaching out to her, pulling her back to a time she had long tried to forget. Determined to confront the issue head-on, Evelyn decided to talk to her daughter, Anne. They had always been close, but this was not a conversation Evelyn was looking forward to. Anne, a practical woman in her 50s, had always looked up to her mother as the epitome of strength and resilience. How would she react to the news? Evelyn imagined the skepticism, the disbelief, the endless questions. She knew that sharing this secret would forever change the way her family saw her, but she couldn't bear the thought of keeping it from them any longer. With a heavy heart, she invited Anne over for tea, knowing full well that this would be one of the most difficult conversations of her life. As they sat in the cozy warmth of the kitchen, surrounded by familiar smells and sounds, Evelyn hesitated and noticed her mother's unease and gently asked, "Mom, is something bothering you? You've been quieter than usual lately." Evelyn took a deep breath and began, recounting the visit to the doctor, the discovery, and the truth about her pregnancy all those years ago, and listened intently, her face a mixture of shock and disbelief. "You've had a baby inside you for 60 years? How is that even possible?" Anne's voice cracked with emotion. She looked at her mother, trying to reconcile the strong, composed woman she had known her entire life with this new, vulnerable version sitting before her. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears as she spoke. "I didn't know, Anne. I had no idea. I thought the baby was gone. The doctors back then told me my body had absorbed it, and I believed them. I grieved and I moved on. But now, after all this time..." Her voice trailed off, and she wiped her eyes, trying to compose herself, and reached across the table, taking her mother's hand in hers. "Mom, I don't know what to say. I can't even imagine how you must be feeling." For the first time in many years, Evelyn felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Sharing the burden of her secret, though painful, was also a relief. But the conversation left more questions than answers. What would they do now? Was it safe for her to continue living with this silent passenger inside her? And more importantly, how had it gone unnoticed for so long? The days that followed her conversation with, and were filled with a strange calm. Though Evelyn still grappled with the enormity of what had been uncovered, she felt lighter, as if sharing the burden had allowed her to reclaim a part of herself that had been lost for so long. Anne, ever the practical one, had insisted on speaking with Dr. Thompson to fully understand her mother's condition and what needed to be done next. But deep down, Evelyn knew that no matter what the doctors said, this was a journey she would have to navigate on her own terms. It wasn't just about the physical presence of the fetus. It was about the emotional scars it had left behind, scars that had never fully healed. Anne's visit to Dr. Thompson only added to the growing complexity of the situation. The doctor explained the risks of surgery at Evelyn's age, but he also expressed concern about the potential for complications if the calcified fetus remained in her body. The conversations were technical and clinical, full of medical jargon that felt detached from the reality of what Evelyn was going through. But amidst all the talk of surgery, risks, and procedures, one thing was clear. Evelyn was the one who would have to make the final decision. "It's your choice, Mrs. Carter," Dr. Thompson had said gently. "We can monitor the situation closely, but if it begins to cause you any discomfort or pain, we may need to intervene." Back home, Evelyn pondered her options. She had never been one to shy away from difficult decisions, but this was different. There was no right answer, no easy solution. She didn't want to put her life at risk, but at the same time, the thought of carrying this burden for the rest of her days was unbearable. As she sat alone in her living room, her thoughts drifted back to John. He had always been her rock, her anchor through every storm. She could almost hear his voice, steady and calm, reassuring her that she would make the right choice. But John was gone, and now Evelyn had to rely on herself, just as she always had. The following morning, and returned with her brother, David. The news had shaken him just as much as it had his sister, though he tried to mask his emotions behind a facade of practicality. "Mom, we need to make sure you're safe. We can't let this thing put your health at risk," he said, his voice steady but filled with concern. Evelyn smiled softly at her son's protective nature, but she knew that no matter how much they loved her, this was not something they could decide for her. "I appreciate your concern, David," she said gently, "but this is something I need to think about carefully. It's not just about the surgery or the risks. It's about what this means for me, for us as a family." The conversation lingered in the air, unresolved. Evelyn knew her children wanted what was best for her, but they couldn't possibly understand the depth of her connection to the life she had lost all those years ago. This fetus, now turned to stone, wasn't just a medical anomaly. It was a piece of her past, a part of her that had been frozen in time. And now, as she stood at the crossroads of an impossible decision, she couldn't help but feel the weight of history pressing down on her. What should have been a simple medical issue had become something far more profound, a question of life, death, and the legacy we leave behind. The days stretched into weeks, and the weight of the decision Evelyn had to make began to press down on her. She tried to continue with her usual routine, attending her church gatherings, spending time with her grandchildren, and staying active around her home. But the secret of the stone fetus felt like a shadow following her every move. No matter where she went or what she did, the reality of her condition stayed with her, silently reminding her of the past she had thought she had laid to rest. Her mind frequently wandered back to the moment Dr. Thompson had shown her the ultrasound, the tiny, mummified fetus that had been with her for so long. It was hard to reconcile that image with the present, where life continued as normal all around her. Anne and David were ever watchful, though they tried not to overwhelm their mother with worry. They visited regularly, checking on her health and gently urging her to make a decision. "Mom, we don't want to pressure you, but Dr. Thompson said we need to monitor this closely," Anne would say, her voice filled with concern. Evelyn appreciated their love and care, but deep down, she knew that this decision was one she had to make on her own. She had never been one to be rushed into anything, and she wasn't about to start now. Yet, as time passed, she couldn't ignore the increasing sense of urgency. The questions circled in her mind. What if the fetus started causing complications? What if her health took a sudden turn? One afternoon, as Evelyn sat by the window watching the autumn leaves fall, she found herself thinking of the child she had lost once again. It was as if the presence of the stone fetus had reopened old wounds, bringing with it a flood of emotions she had long buried. She thought about what might have been, the life she and John had envisioned with a child, the birthdays, the first steps, the milestones they had never gotten to experience. It was a grief that she had never fully processed, and now, at 91, She found herself grappling with it all over again. But as painful as these thoughts were, there was also a strange comfort in knowing that a part of her child had always been with her, even if she hadn't known it. As the evening sun cast a golden light across the room, Evelyn made a decision. She would speak to Dr. Thompson one more time. She needed to fully understand what the risks were, both of leaving the fetus in place and of attempting a surgery at her age. It wasn't just about what was happening inside her body. It was about how she wanted to live the rest of her life. Evelyn had always believed in the importance of quality over quantity, and she wasn't interested in prolonging her life at the expense of her independence or well-being. If the doctors could assure her that the fetus posed no immediate danger, she was inclined to leave it where it was. After all, it had been with her for 60 years. What was a few more? That night, as she lay in bed, Evelyn felt a sense of peace wash over her. She hadn't fully made up her mind, but she was close. The next step was to speak with Dr. Thompson and hear his thoughts one last time. She would also need to sit down with Anne and David and explain her decision to them, whatever it might be. They deserved to know her reasoning, and she wanted them to understand that, while she valued their input, this was something she had to decide for herself. With a heart that felt lighter than it had in weeks, Evelyn closed her eyes, ready to face the next chapter of her journey with grace and courage. The next morning, Evelyn woke up with a clarity she hadn't felt in weeks. She knew that today would be the day she would visit Dr. Thompson and make her decision. She wasn't afraid. There was a calm determination in her heart. After all, she had lived a long, fulfilling life, and this was simply another chapter in her story. As she dressed in her best coat and carefully applied a touch of lipstick, Evelyn looked at herself in the mirror. Her reflection showed the lines of age and experience, but her eyes still held the spark of a woman who had faced life's challenges head-on. Today would be no different, and insisted on accompanying her to the clinic. Though Evelyn appreciated the support, she made it clear that this was her decision to make. "Mom, I know you'll make the right choice, whatever that is," and said softly as they drove. Evelyn smiled, but remained focused on the day ahead. She had already played out the conversation with Dr. Thompson in her mind. She would ask him directly, was the fetus truly a danger? Was there any reason to act immediately? And most importantly, would any surgical intervention offer more harm than good? When they arrived at the clinic, Dr. Thompson greeted them warmly, but with the gravity that the situation required. He had been following Evelyn's case closely, consulting with specialists, and reviewing every possible angle. As they sat down in his office, Evelyn wasted no time in getting to the point. "Dr. Thompson, I need to know exactly what the risks are if we leave things as they are. I'm not interested in surgery unless it's absolutely necessary." Dr. Thompson leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "Mrs. Carter, after reviewing everything, I can tell you that while there's always a small risk with something like this, I don't believe it's an immediate danger to your health. At your age, surgery could introduce more complications than benefits. I would recommend that we monitor it closely, and if there's any sign of trouble, we'll address it then." Evelyn let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. The doctor's words were a relief, confirming what she had suspected all along. She had lived with this for 60 years, and now, she could continue to live her life without the fear of imminent danger. "Thank you, Dr. Thompson," she said, her voice steady. "I appreciate your honesty," and sat quietly beside her mother, listening but not interrupting. She knew this was Evelyn's moment to take control, and she respected her mother's decision, even if it wasn't what she had expected. As they left the clinic, the air felt lighter. Evelyn had made her choice, and with it came a newfound sense of freedom. There would be no surgery, no drastic measures. Instead, she would live her life just as she always had, on her own terms. She and Anne drove home in comfortable silence, the tension of the last few weeks melting away. When they arrived back at Evelyn's house and finally spoke, "I'm proud of you, Mom. You've always known what's best for yourself, and I'm glad you didn't let anyone push you into something you weren't ready for." Evelyn smiled, feeling the warmth of her daughter's words. "Thank you, Anne. I've had a lot of time to think about it, and I'm at peace with my decision." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Evelyn sat on her porch, watching the sky turn shades of pink and orange. She sipped her tea and breathed in the cool autumn air, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. The stone fetus inside her was no longer a burden. It was a part of her history, a reminder of the life she had lived and the love she had shared. In some strange way, it had become a symbol of her resilience, of the way she had carried on through every hardship and loss. And now, as she looked out over her quiet street, Evelyn knew that whatever the future held, she was ready to face it with grace and dignity. As the weeks turned into months, Evelyn found a new sense of peace in her life. The once looming weight of her condition had gradually faded into the background, becoming something she rarely thought about. Life carried on as it always had, filled with the small joys of everyday routines and the comforting presence of her family. Anne and David, though still concerned, had come to accept their mother's decision. They visited often, checking in not just on her health, but also on her spirits, which remained as lively and sharp as ever. Evelyn had always been the matriarch of the family, and now, even at 91, she continued to hold that position with grace. But something had shifted within her, subtle but undeniable. The discovery of the fetus, though no longer a source of fear, had awakened something in Evelyn, a desire to revisit the past and confront memories she had long kept at bay. As she flipped through old photo albums and sifted through letters from decades ago, she found herself reflecting on her life in a way she hadn't before. She thought often of John, her late husband, and the life they had built together. Their marriage had been a good one, filled with love and companionship, but it hadn't been without its share of sorrow. The loss of their child had been the greatest of these sorrows, and though they had moved forward, it had left a mark on their lives, a silent grief they had carried together. One afternoon, Evelyn found herself walking through the town cemetery, where John had been laid to rest all those years ago. The autumn leaves crunched underfoot as she made her way to his gravestone, the familiar ache of loss settling in her chest. She hadn't visited in some time, but today, the need to reconnect with him felt stronger than ever. As she stood by his grave, she spoke softly, almost as if he were there with her. "John, I've been thinking about our little one. I found out something recently, something I never could have imagined." Her voice wavered as she recounted the discovery of the stone fetus, the child they had lost but, in some way, had never truly left her. "I guess I never really said goodbye, did I?" she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. Standing there, Evelyn realized how much she had kept hidden from herself over the years. The grief of losing their child had never been fully processed. It had been pushed aside, buried deep within, just as the fetus had been buried inside her. But now, with this new understanding of her past, she felt ready to let go. Not of the memory of her child or the love she had carried, but of the weight of the loss that had held her back for so long. She knelt down, placing a small bouquet of flowers by John's gravestone. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "for everything." As she left the cemetery, Evelyn felt a lightness in her step that had been missing for years. She had faced her past, confronted the ghosts of her memories, and in doing so, had found a sense of closure she hadn't known she needed. The stone fetus was still with her, a reminder of that part of her life, but it no longer felt like a burden. Instead, it had become a testament to her strength, a symbol of the life she had lived and the resilience that had carried her through. And as she walked home, the crisp autumn air filling her lungs, Evelyn knew she had finally made peace with the echoes of time. As winter approached, Evelyn found herself more reflective than ever. The past few months had been a whirlwind of emotions, but now, with the cold air settling in and the days growing shorter, she felt a sense of finality, as though the chapter of her life that had been marked by the discovery of the stone fetus was coming to a close. Her decision to leave it untouched had brought her peace, and her visit to John's grave had helped her finally release the lingering grief she had carried for so long. Now, her thoughts turned to her children and grandchildren, to the legacy she would leave behind. Evelyn had always been a storyteller. Over the years, she had regaled her family with stories of her youth, of the adventures she and John had shared, and of the hardships they had endured. But there was one story she had never told, the story of the child she had lost and the unimaginable discovery that followed. It wasn't that she wanted to keep it hidden. Rather, It had taken her so long to come to terms with it herself that she hadn't known how to share it with those she loved. But now, with her newfound peace, Evelyn felt ready. She wanted her family to understand her journey, to see the strength that had carried her through her life, even in the face of unimaginable loss. One snowy evening, Evelyn invited her family over for dinner. Anne and David came with their children, filling the house with the sounds of laughter and warmth. As they gathered around the table, Evelyn watched them with quiet joy, grateful for the love and support that had always surrounded her. After dinner, as everyone settled into the living room, Evelyn cleared her throat. "There's something I want to share with all of you," she began, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "It's something I've kept to myself for a long time, but I think it's time you knew." The room grew quiet as Evelyn told her story, starting with the pregnancy she had lost 60 years ago and the discovery that had shaken her world. Her children listened in stunned silence, their faces a mix of shock, sadness, and awe. "I didn't know," Evelyn continued, her voice soft but resolute. "I had no idea that I had carried that child with me for all these years. But now, after everything, I feel like I've come to terms with it. I've made peace with the past, and I want you all to know that I'm okay." Tears welled up in Anne's eyes as she reached for her mother's hand. "Mom, I can't even imagine what you've been through," she whispered. David, too, looked visibly moved, though he remained silent, processing the gravity of what he had just learned. Evelyn smiled, feeling the weight of her secret lift as she shared it with those she loved most. "I didn't tell you this to make you sad," she said gently. "I told you because I want you to know that even in the face of loss, we can find strength. We can carry on, and we can live full, meaningful lives, no matter what happens. That's the legacy I want to leave behind. Not the story of loss, but the story of resilience." Her words hung in the air, sinking into the hearts of her children and grandchildren. They saw her now not just as their mother and grandmother, but as a woman who had faced incredible challenges and had come through them with grace and courage. As the evening drew to a close, Evelyn felt a sense of fulfillment. She had shared her truth, and in doing so, had strengthened the bonds with her family. The discovery of the stone fetus, once a source of confusion and fear, had become a symbol of her strength, a part of her life's journey that she could now embrace fully. And as the snow fell softly outside, blanketing the world in quiet stillness, Evelyn knew that she had left her family with something far more important than a secret. She had given them the gift of understanding, of resilience, and of love. Winter deepened, bringing with it a sense of quiet that suited Evelyn's reflective state. Her conversation with her family had lifted a weight from her shoulders that she hadn't realized she was still carrying. In the days that followed, she found herself embracing life with a renewed sense of purpose, savoring the moments with her children and grandchildren, knowing that the time left to her was precious. She had always believed in living life with grace and dignity, and now, more than ever, she wanted to make the most of each day. One evening, as the wind howled outside and the fire crackled in the hearth, Evelyn sat by the window, watching the snowflakes drift lazily to the ground. It was a scene she had witnessed countless times over her long life, but tonight it felt different. There was a stillness in the air, a quiet that echoed the peace she felt within herself. For the first time in many years, Evelyn felt truly free, not just from the physical burden of the stone fetus, but from the emotional scars of the past. She had shared her story, and in doing so, she had reclaimed it. The grief that had once weighed her down had transformed into something else, a testament to her resilience, to the strength she had drawn upon time and time again throughout her life. But even as she embraced this new chapter of her life, Evelyn couldn't help but feel a sense of closure approaching. She had lived a long, full life, and while she wasn't afraid of what lay ahead, she knew that her time was coming to an end. It wasn't a feeling of dread or fear, but rather a quiet acceptance. She had always believed that life was a journey, and that each stage had its own lessons to teach. Now, at 91, she had learned all that life had to offer, and she was ready to move on to whatever came next. Her family, ever attentive, noticed the change in her demeanor. Though Evelyn remained active and engaged, there was a serenity about her that was impossible to miss, and, in particular, had grown even closer to her mother in the weeks following their emotional conversation. She visited often, sometimes just to sit with Evelyn in comfortable silence, the bond between them deepening with each passing day. David, too, made time to visit more frequently, bringing his children with him so they could spend time with their grandmother. The house, once filled with the noise and chaos of young children, now felt peaceful but not lonely. It was a place of love, a home where Evelyn's legacy of strength and resilience would live on long after she was gone. One day, as the first signs of spring began to appear, Evelyn felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of peace. She had spent the morning with Anne, reminiscing about old times and laughing at the stories they had shared. As the day wore on, she retreated to her favorite chair by the window, gazing out at the world she had come to know so well. The sun was setting, casting a golden light over the snow that still clung to the ground. Evelyn closed her eyes, breathing in the stillness of the moment, and in that quiet space, she knew that her journey was complete. That evening, surrounded by the warmth of her family's love, Evelyn passed away peacefully in her sleep. There was no pain, no fear, just the quiet passing of a woman who had lived her life with grace, strength, and dignity. Anne and David were heartbroken, but they knew that their mother had found the peace she had sought for so long. Her passing, though difficult to accept, was a reminder of the legacy she had left behind. A legacy of resilience, of love, and of the quiet strength that had carried her through life's greatest challenges. In the days that followed, as family and friends gathered to celebrate Evelyn's life, Anne and David found comfort in the stories that were shared. Their mother had touched so many lives, and her strength had been a source of inspiration to all who knew her. As they stood by her grave, watching the final moments of her life come to a close, they knew that Evelyn's story was far from over. It would live on in the hearts of her children, her grandchildren, and all who had been fortunate enough to know her. Evelyn Carter had lived a life filled with love, loss, and everything in between. And in the end, she had found peace, not just with the world around her, but with herself. Her journey had come full circle, and in her passing, she had left behind a legacy that would endure for generations to come. Spring had fully bloomed by the time Evelyn Carter's family gathered for a final tribute to her life. The sun shone brightly on the small gathering at the cemetery, casting a warm light over the fresh flowers laid around her headstone. Evelyn's absence was felt deeply, but in her place, there was a profound sense of peace. Anne, David, and their families stood quietly, reflecting on the life of the woman who had been their guiding light for so long. It was not just the grief of losing a mother that they carried with them. It was the pride of knowing the legacy she left behind. In the weeks following Evelyn's passing, Anne and David found themselves reflecting on the lessons she had imparted, not just in her final months, but throughout her life. Evelyn had always been a woman of quiet strength, someone who faced life's hardships with grace and determination. Her journey, from losing a child to living unknowingly with that child's remains, had become a story of resilience that her family would pass down through generations. For Anne and David, it was more than just a story about their mother. It was a testament to the power of perseverance, love, and healing. As they stood by her grave that spring morning and held her mother's journal in her hands, Evelyn had started writing it in her final weeks, documenting her thoughts, her memories, and the lessons she wanted to leave behind for her children and grandchildren. It was filled with stories of her childhood, her life with John, and the joys and sorrows of raising a family. But the most powerful part of the journal was her reflection on the discovery of the stone fetus, the event that had brought her past and present crashing together in a way she never expected. "I never knew how much of my life was still shaped by the loss of that child," Evelyn had written in one of her final entries. "But now, I understand that grief is not something we leave behind. It stays with us in ways we don't always recognize. And that's okay. It's part of who we are, part of what makes us human. I carried that child for 60 years, but I also carried the love that came with it. And in the end, that love is what matters most." Those words resonated deeply with Anne and David as they stood together at their mother's grave. Her strength had not come from pushing aside the pain or pretending it wasn't there. It had come from carrying it with her, allowing it to shape her, but never letting it define her. Evelyn's life had been full of joy and sorrow, but through it all, she had chosen love. And that choice, more than anything, was her greatest legacy. After the service, as the family slowly dispersed, Anne and David lingered by their mother's grave. "She was remarkable," David said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "She was," Anne agreed, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "And now it's up to us to carry that forward, to live with the same strength and grace that she did." They stood there for a few more moments, feeling the weight of Evelyn's absence, but also the warmth of her presence in their hearts. She had lived a long, full life, and in the end, she had found peace. And though she was gone, her legacy of love and resilience would live on in the generations to come. As they walked away, the spring breeze rustled the leaves of the nearby trees, carrying with it the soft, gentle reminder of the life that had touched so many. Evelyn Carter's journey had come to an end, but her story, her legacy, would endure. It was a story of love, of loss, and of the quiet strength that binds families together across the years. And for Anne, David, and all who had known her, that was more than enough. Months passed since Evelyn's peaceful passing, yet her presence lingered in the lives of her children and grandchildren, like the soft glow of a setting sun. Anne and David, still processing the depth of their loss, found themselves drawn to the memories of their mother. Her stories, her laughter, the wisdom she had imparted, and the strength she had carried through her final months. The journal she had left behind had become a treasured keepsake, a window into the mind of the woman who had guided them through life's challenges. It held more than just reflections. It was a roadmap to understanding her journey. And, in particular, found comfort in reading and rereading her mother's entries. Each time, she discovered new layers of Evelyn's emotional journey. The entry about the stone fetus resonated most deeply. It was a story that seemed almost impossible, yet it was real. A part of her mother's hidden history that had shaped her in ways and hadn't fully understood until recently. "Carrying grief is not a burden, but a part of life's landscape," Evelyn had written. "It changes shape, sometimes light, sometimes heavy, but it's always there, teaching us to live fully in the face of sorrow." One afternoon, Anne sat with her own daughter, Lily, as they flipped through the journal together. Lily, a teenager with a quiet wisdom beyond her years, had been particularly close to her grandmother. She had always admired Evelyn's strength, but now, as she read about the discovery of the stone fetus, she saw her grandmother in a new light. "I never realized she went through so much," Lily whispered. "She was so strong, even when she didn't talk about it," and nodded, her eyes misting. "I think she wanted us to know that strength doesn't always come from talking about the hard things. Sometimes it's about carrying them with you, like she did. But in the end, she wanted us to understand that the love she carried was stronger than the grief." That evening, Anne found herself sitting by the window, much like her mother had in those final months. She gazed out at the same world Evelyn had watched over, the same sky that had seen the weight of her mother's story unfold. And as the stars began to appear in the twilight, Anne realized that her mother's journey hadn't ended with her passing. It had transformed into something greater, a legacy that was now part of her own life, and one that she would pass on to her children. David, meanwhile, had been quietly working on a project to honor his mother's memory. He was a practical man, not given to displays of emotion, but Evelyn's death had stirred something in him. He wanted to ensure that her story, especially the astonishing discovery of the stone fetus, was not forgotten. He began writing a memoir, weaving together her life stories with the incredible medical anomaly that had shaped her final years. It was a way to preserve her legacy, but it was also a way for David to process his own grief. In the quiet of his study, he wrote late into the night, recalling the details of Evelyn's life, her resilience, her humor, and the love she had given so freely. The words flowed as if guided by her spirit, and by the time he finished the first draft, he felt a deep sense of connection to his mother, as though she had been sitting beside him the whole time, guiding his hand. The memoir wasn't just about the stone fetus. It was about the woman who had lived through it, the mother who had raised him, and the strength that had carried her through a life filled with both joy and sorrow. As David's memoir neared completion, he shared it with Anne, unsure of how she would react to seeing their mother's life documented in such a way. He had poured his heart into the writing, capturing not just the facts but the emotions, the quiet moments, and the powerful lessons their mother had imparted. When Anne finished reading it, tears streamed down her face. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "Mom would be so proud of you." The siblings decided to publish the memoir, not just for their own family, but for others who might find strength in Evelyn's story. The medical world had long been fascinated by cases like Evelyn's, and David felt that sharing her story could bring awareness not only to the rare condition she had lived with, but also to the emotional journey she had taken. But more than that, they wanted to honor the quiet resilience she had embodied throughout her life. Evelyn's story was one of love, loss, and healing, universal themes that could touch the hearts of many. The book, titled The Weight of Love, A Mother's Journey Through Loss and Resilience, was published a year after Evelyn's death. It garnered attention not only for the medical mystery it recounted, but for the deeply personal, emotional journey of a woman who had lived through unimaginable circumstances. Readers from all walks of life found inspiration in Evelyn's strength and the grace with which she had carried her secret for so long. The book became a symbol of endurance, reminding people that even in the face of life's greatest challenges, love could carry them through. Anne and David traveled to a few speaking engagements, where they shared their mother's story with others who had faced loss and grief. They spoke not just about the incredible medical anomaly, but about the importance of family, resilience, and the power of love. At one event, a woman approached them after the talk, her eyes filled with tears. "I lost a child years ago, and I never thought I'd be able to talk about it," she said, her voice trembling. "But your mother's story has given me the strength to face my own grief. Thank you for sharing her with us." It was in moments like these that Anne and David knew they had made the right decision. Their mother's story, once a deeply private experience, had become a source of healing for others. Evelyn's legacy wasn't just about her strength in facing the stone fetus. It was about the love she had shared with her family and the resilience she had passed on to the next generation. As the years went by, Evelyn's memory remained ever present in the lives of her children and grandchildren. Her legacy was no longer confined to the small circle of family who had known her intimately. It had expanded, touching the lives of strangers who had read her story and found comfort in her resilience. In the end, Evelyn had achieved what she had always wanted: to leave behind a legacy of love, strength, and quiet grace that would carry on long after she was gone. And as Anne and David continued to live their lives, raising their own children and grandchildren, they did so with the knowledge that their mother's story would live on, not just in the pages of a book, but in the hearts of all who had known her and had been touched by her incredible journey. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more content like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. And now, you have a new video appearing on the screen, full of unexpected twists and touching moments. Click and get ready for another inspiring story.